I think my racial identity development manifested pretty similar to how people in my peer group where I grew up, we had similar experiences. I grew up in Northern California, so we had a little more racial diversity probably than other parts of the United States. I was close to San Francisco, big cities, things like that. And my parents grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I view them as somewhat on the cutting edge of trying to change institutionalized racism with their own ability, and especially within our family. I remember my parents debriefing me after we would go visit one of my uncles because he was particularly blatantly racist. And in fact, my cousin married a black man and he cut her off from the family. So I didn't really understand why I lost contact with her at 10 years old. I understand it now. But I did grow up understanding that institutionalized racism was a problem, but it wasn't until adulthood that I realized my role in it as a white person. And it's not that my parents didn't try to educate me, but they were also, white people living in institutionalized racism, and so we have a part of that. And our journey has been, owning that and trying to eradicate it to the best of our ability. My first identifiable experience with witnessing institutionalized racism was in 1996. My coworker Brandon was a young male in his 20s, and he was late for an appointment, and I needed help with it. So I thought he needed to know why I was frustrated that he was late. And he apologized, and he explained that he had just been pulled over for being black, and it caused him to be late. And I'd never heard of being pulled over for being black. So I asked him what that meant. And although I was just in community college at the time, I had some knowledge of racism, growing up in my family, what I learned and my experiences. But I hadn't fully thought about the fact that there was institutionalized racism. But he went on to explain in more detail for me, which I really appreciate that, especially looking back now. He shouldn't have had to explain his experiences, but if he hadn't done that, then I might not have understood until much later. So I am very grateful to him for sharing that information with me. He explained that I needed to consider the whole picture. He's a black man in his, young mid-20s, and he's kind of got a beater car, he called it. So this is what I remember him saying. Police tend to profile people like me. Maybe it is because they're looking for an actual criminal who fits my description, or maybe it's that they assume that I'm committing a crime because I'm black and my car makes me look poor. It happens to me all the time. I mean, how many times have you been pulled over this year? And I said, none. And he said, I've been pulled over 13 times. And do you know how many tickets I've gotten? I had no idea. I asked how many, and Brandon replied, 0. I'm not breaking the law. I'm driving while black. That's institutionalized racism. I've never experienced institutional racism personally, and I know that my privilege in society comes from my whiteness and my middle class status. And my coworker Brandon and I were both in the intimacy versus isolation stages of development when he first described this to me and helped me understand the reality of institutionalized racism. I really had to think about this question for this class. I do think that Brandon shared a very intimate and personal experience with me by informing me and educating me about his experiences as a black man. And if he had not done that, it might have been a different experience for me when I went on to get my BSW, going on to work. But that first understanding that he gave me of institutionalized racism, it really helped me to reframe the lens that I use to look at other people's experiences. Before that talk he had with me, I was aware of racism. I knew it was wrong. I knew a little bit about white privilege, and I definitely knew about white power because I grew up in a town that was defined as the place where all of the white trash racists live. So I knew that existed, and I knew I didn't want to be a, quote, white trash racist. But his conversation with me that day totally changed my lens. I hadn't heard of critical race theory, and to be honest, I've never heard of it until this class. I mean, I understand and I've understood the concept of it, but I've never heard it described as an actual theory. But it is the most accurate theory that I've ever heard regarding the reality of racism and the need to acknowledge institutional racism before we do anything else. From the reading Critical Race Theory and Social Work, the scholars Abrams, Gibson, Razak, and Jeffrey noted that students are often resistant to materials on racism, particularly when it comes to white privilege. For example, students may deny occupying a privileged position at the expense of other social groups, and this denial may even take the form of anger, guilt, and resentment. And this is all from Julia, 2000. Helms in 1995 contends that the multicultural model may be unable to usher students from these defensive responses to a place where they can critique their own privilege. So as a result, the multicultural approach may not be able to help agents of oppressions counter any false sense of superiority. And this is problematic because the oppressors are often trained not to see the advantages they have gained at the expense of the oppressed. And that's from McIntosh in 1989. And I work in child welfare, and I'm responsible for the education of MSW and BSW students in their field internship. So this is definitely something I can do, and I have been doing this. I think I can do a better job, but I recognize that as well. I have confronted and challenged comments that students have made that have promoted institutionalized racism or that talk about their privilege that they don't recognize they have. I do that in group supervision, in private supervision. I definitely can do more, but I do think it's a very important part of their learning. And I also contribute to the whole program's mission and the Code of Ethics at NASW, but also specifically talking about the racial disparities in child welfare, how that happens, why that happens, at least from our understanding, and what we can do to change that. And a lot of it has to do with changing mindsets and changing the thought that, well, this just happens, this is just kind of how it is. Yes, this is how it happens, but it doesn't have to be how it is. And the first thing we need to do is understand that it does exist and there is something that we can do about it. But you have to be courageous enough to have that voice. And that can be scary sometimes. I would not dream of responding differently to the scenario that I had with Brandon because I truly appreciate his comfort with wanting to educate me. And I know that this is one of the problems with racism. The burden falls on the people who have had the experiences to educate people like me who have not had the experiences. And that in itself creates a power differential. The burden should fall on me as the person who knows she is in an unearned position of privilege to share the experiences that I've had and continue to develop my understanding of critical race theory so that I can educate my students who are future social workers about institutionalized racism. There was a student in our group who used the term "I don't see color" as part of his answer to a discussion. And I felt very uncomfortable with this phrase, but rather than to let it sit there and avoid the conflict, I responded with my reasons why I found this phrase to be lacking understanding of the reality of experiences for people of color. So I want to teach and encourage my students to have those uncomfortable, courageous conversations. It's hard. It's hard to talk about disparities of any kind, especially when they're institutionalized and it can feel hopeless. But I do believe in the power to impact one person. Brandon was my one person. He definitely impacted me. I'm sure he has no idea, but his courageousness in sharing his story with me has made a difference in my life and in the life of many others.